Hi class, in this recording we're going to focus on the countercurrent multiplier, a classic concept that we have to cover with the urinary system. And as we look at the countercurrent multiplier, it's going to allow for us to highly concentrate our urine by maintaining a salt or salinity gradient within the renal medulla. As we look at the filtrate, or the tubular fluid that is entering the collecting duct, it's at about 300 milliosmolars. But by the time it leaves the collecting duct, it's at about 1200 milliosmolars. And as we look at this countercurrent multiplier, a lot of it depends on our nephron loop, or loop of Henry. We say multiplier because we're going to continually recapture the salt that we're losing and return it to the extracellular fluid of the medulla, which is going to upregulate the osmolarity of the adrenal medulla. And we say countercurrent because liquid flows in opposite directions within the nephron loop. So as we look at the fluid that's going downward in the descending limb of the nephron loop, we're going to have the fluid be exposed to ever increasing saline concentrations, which is going to cause more and more water to leave the filtrate via osmosis. And because the downward portion of the nephron loop is primarily made of a simple squamous epithelium, it's very permeable to water. However, it's not very permeable to sodium chloride. So the sodium chloride tends to become concentrated in the filtrate as it moves down. And then by the time we get to that bottom curve of the nephron loop, we find that we have highly concentrated filtrate in the bottom of the nephron loop. And then as our fluid is going up the nephron loop, we are going to have a simple cuboidal epithelium actively transporting, I'll shift to red here, ions out of the filtrate into the extracellular fluid. And this causes the electrolyte concentration of the extracellular fluid to go up and the osmolarity of the filtrate to go back down again by the time the filtrate gets to the top of the nephron loop. So to show it in terms of a picture, we are going to have dilute filtrate enter the nephron loop. It becomes concentrated as water is pulled out, and then on the way back up, we dilute the filtrate not by adding water, but instead we dilute the filtrate by pulling ions out of it, electrolytes out of it with active transport. On the way down, it's a passive osmotic process pulling water out. On the way up, it's an active transport process pulling the electrolytes out. And ultimately, the concentration of the filtrate is much lower at the end compared to the concentration at the halfway point. As we're looking at urea, we need to recycle this chemical compound as well to help regulate osmolarity deep in the renal medulla. And as we look at that lower end of the collecting duct, that collecting duct is highly permeable to urea, but the thick segment of the nephron loop and the distal convoluted tubule is not permeable to urea. What does this mean? This means that we can have urea cycling back and forth constantly. And I'm going to go forward a slide here just to help illustrate this point. So urea can go out of the filtrate in the collecting duct to the extracellular fluid of the renal medulla. And then within the descending limb of the nephron loop, urea can go back into the filtrate. So the filtrate gains urea on the descending limb of the nephron loop and then loses urea within the collecting duct. So this means that we're going to have urea continually cycled between the collecting duct and the nephron loop and back. There's this cycling of the urea. It's also worth emphasizing that we still are going to have an overall higher concentration of urea within the collecting duct, so that we always are going to have a net movement of urea out of the collecting duct into the renal medulla, also so that we can urinate out our nitrogenous waste products. There are some capillary beds that we need to talk about too again. We have the vasa recta, and that vasa recta is the capillary bed that wraps around the nephron loop. It's going to supply lots of blood to the tissues of the renal medulla, but the vasa recta does not remove the sodium ions and urea from the extracellular fluid of the renal medulla. This allows for the efficient cycling of those ions between the extracellular fluid and the filtrate within the renal tubules. And as we look at the countercurrent system with the blood capillaries are going to have movement, or the blood will be flowing in opposite directions in adjacent parallel capillaries. So let's go forward a slide here to illustrate that point. Oop, there's no vasa recta there. Sorry about that. Let me back up here. Clear. So as the blood capillaries, if we have a nephron loop right here, we have the vasa recta wrapping around the nephron loop. And I'm using red to represent those blood capillaries. And within the vasa recta, blood flows down one direction and up the opposite direction. So they flow in, the blood within the vasa recta is going to flow opposite directions. Well, the vasa recta wraps around the nephron loop. The descending capillaries of the vasa recta are going to trade water and salt. And as the water is moving out of those capillaries, the salt will move in. So here is a slide helping to tie these concepts together. We have blood from the vasa recta, which is illustrated over here. This red tube represents the vasa recta. As the blood goes down, water goes out, sodium chloride goes in, and then as the blood goes back up again, we have water re-entering the blood, and we have sodium chloride exiting the blood. So opposite things happen at opposite loops or limbs of the vasa recta. So the ascending capillaries are going to exchange the salt for water. Water is going to go in, sodium chloride is going to go out of the blood, and the vasa recta ultimately gives the salt back that it took, so it doesn't alter the osmolarity of our medulla, helping to maintain the osmolarity gradient as we go deeper into the medulla that powers the movement of fluids within the nephron loop and the collecting ducts. So ultimately, this is a fabulous summary of how we have tubular absorption and secretion. So in the proximal convoluted tubule, we have most of our tubular reabsorption. So notice all these really exciting things that we reabsorb in the proximal convoluted tubule. We have a little bit of tubular secretion in the proximal convoluted tubule. Within the nephron loop, we're going to be primarily concerned with reabsorbing water and secreting urea and some dissolved electrolytes as well. Within the distal convoluted tubule, we are going to modify pH. And we modify pH by either adding hydrogen ions and or absorbing bicarbonate ions. And then in the collecting duct, we reabsorb, so we lose water and urea. So it's kind of a lot with this countercurrent multiplier system. Just know that a key idea to think about here is that fluids are going to move with their concentration gradients, or chemicals move downhill with their concentration gradients unless we have active transport powering their movement. And those concentration gradients are going to be maintained by pumps using active transport. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in our class discussion board or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.